Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another edition of your discursive, informative program. It is Global Insider, brought to you by Global on your Pan-African television. And of course, today we want to zoom on the Ukraine crisis and looking at the position of Europe, particularly the European Union, and asking if the bloc has lost its diplomatic voice. Each passing day, the proxy nature of the Ukraine crisis unravel itself. However, the event this time have brought division within the ideological and pragmatic EU-backed stance towards the war, especially using the proceeds of the Russian frozen assets in Belgium to back Kyiv government, a move that Belgium has strongly refuted. The special military operation that kick-started in February 2022 has again brought to the limelight the 2014 gimmicks of the West, patterning the Minsk agreement and the meeting between then UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson with President Zelensky of Ukraine, which shattered peace prospects over the years. Now the crisis has not only reshaped geopolitical landscape in Eastern Europe, but has also exposed significant divisions of fissures in the diplomatic framework of the European Union. The EU's voice, previously regarded, according to report, as a crucial actor in international diplomacy, appears to have diminished, leading to serious questions about its relevance and effectiveness in resolving the crisis. As per reports, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has boldly asserted that Europe has effectively removed itself from the negotiation table from the preamble itself, citing its past failures to uphold agreements and its alleged complicity in derailing peace efforts. The U.S. emerges as a dominant force in diplomacy in the Ukraine crisis. European leaders find themselves grappling with internal divisions, limited financial resources, and the pressing need for a unified strategy as far as the situation is concerned. This complicated web of geopolitical maneuvers raises vital questions. How has Europe's commitment to ideological posturing compromised its diplomatic effectiveness? Are the EU's internal divisions with respect to foreign policy hampering its ability to influence negotiations pertaining the Ukrainian crisis, and with the U.S. increasingly stirring discussions behind closed doors? This is particularly pertaining the recent proposed peace plan that could end the flare between the Ukraine and Russia. What does this mean for Europe's standing as a global power? And of course, we are somehow tempted to say that at this juncture, the EU or Europe has found itself wanting. Stating, ladies and gentlemen, as we unravel the state of the current situation or state of affairs pertaining the Ukraine crisis, the position of the EU, and of course the United States of America and Russia and Ukraine, on this edition of Global Insider. I'll join you right after the jingle. And you're welcome back. If you are just tuning in, this is Global Insider. Has the EU found itself wanting? This and more we're going to uncover on this edition of Global Insider. Without much ado, we are taking you straight away to the Moscow, particularly in Russia, to meet Arnaud Doubly, who is a political consultant as well as an international lawyer. Thank you so much, dear Arnaud, for accepting to decode this very important and timely subject matter with us.
Yes, hello, Clarisse. Thank you very much for having me. Hope to have a insightful and rich conversation.
Absolutely, yeah, with you as an expert, having firsthand information on the Ukraine crisis and every element that has been made or embedded into its trajectory, we are going to understand again better to know the state of affairs with you pertaining the latest development, especially around the U.S. brokered peace talks. And of course, to Scotland, let's acknowledge the presence of Conrad Rekers, who is a journalist, financial analyst, chair of the Polish Yes for Independent Scotland. It's a pleasure having you this day.
Hello, Clarisse. I'm really honored for this opportunity to discuss one of the most important international events of our times. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for accepting and honoring our rendezvous this day, Conrad. And of course, subsequently, ladies and gentlemen, other guests will be joining as we unravel the intricate web surrounding the Ukraine crisis and, of course, the position of Europe, particularly its diplomatic voice. But before we enter into the discussions, let's get this except outlining how Europe or the EU has lost its diplomatic hand or voice as far as the negotiations towards ensuring peace, full settlement of the flare between Russia and Ukraine is concerned.
It's lost it steadily. I mean, obviously, Ukraine matters enormously to Europe, and it matters enormously to Europe that Russia does not in any sense win for Ukrainians' own sake, for European security, and for principles of justice and international law. But it is the US's view under this administration that Europe does not much matter, which is why talks are happening in a way that, as you described, repeatedly tilts towards a US-Russia dialogue, leaving out Europe and indeed often Ukraine. And how did that happen? Well, it's happened in different ways. President Trump, I think, has won the argument, rightly, that Europe should pay more for its own defense. And this is something that I remember American military people making a point, making back in the time of the Kosovo War. So this has gone on for decades and decades, and indeed since the Second World War. But he has made that point very forcefully, and I think won that argument. The European countries are still trying to work out how they get that spending to rise. We were talking earlier about how in the UK's case you get population to wean themselves off welfare and benefits and put that money into defence, a very unpopular direction. So there's one thing that Europe has to do, but you ask what has happened that Europe's ended up in that position. That is one, not paying enough to its own defence. Another is actually during the conduct of the war, not being fast or willing enough to give Ukraine the weapons that Europe does have to some extent at an earlier stage of the war when they could have been even more useful. And now Europe doesn't have so many cards in this, but it does have one, which is the frozen assets, predominantly held in Belgium, but not entirely. And it now needs, in my view, to come to a decision on that, because that is one of the things that where the US does acknowledge, and Russia does acknowledge, that Europe has something to say. But if Europe is not careful, that is going to be grabbed by an American-led negotiating process, possibly not for Europe's or Ukraine's advantage.
And of course, that was Bernard Maddox, Director and Chief Executive of Chatham House. Welcome. And of course, it's always imperative to put into context discussions. And I'll right off with you, dear Arnold, to wanting to understand topic for today, looking at the probably the historical context of European diplomacy pertaining the Ukraine crisis.
Clarisse. Well, obviously, for purpose of context, it's important to probably go back 20 years in the past, let's say around the time when the Bush administration was trying to justify an illegal war of invasion on Iraq. And if you recall, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Donald Rumsfeld, decided that in order to placate at the time Germany, headed by then German Chancellor Schröder, and France, headed at the time by President Jacques Chirac, it was decided that the center of gravity of Europe needed to be, as it were, moved eastward, what Rumsfeld himself called the New Europe. Mainly countries like the Baltic states, Poland, and already at the time Ukraine. Even though Ukraine was not in the EU, it's still not in the EU. But if we look at what happened a few years later in 2008 with the Bucharest summit, Georgia and Ukraine were slated to join the European Union potentially and NATO. Obviously, history has had a different opinion as to the implementation of such projects, but the idea was already there that in order to circumvent problematic Western European countries, i.e. France and Germany, who, if you recall, had somewhat brought together what could have worked over the long term as an axis between Paris, Berlin, and Moscow. And the US was really, really annoyed about this. They, in the words of Condoleezza Rice at the time, France was to be punished and Germany was to be coerced. And basically the overall approach was to, again, favor and cajole countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and the likes. Those countries eventually joined the first coalition of the willing, and in so doing led the way in the occupation of Iraq, which is lasting up to today. But when we look at Europe, to make a long story short, is that the process of extension of adding new members ever so, which coincides with the NATO agenda of moving eastward in violation of the promises that were made in 1990 in order to confront Russia at its own borders. Obviously was not thought out very carefully, because in so doing, first of all, the amount of member states makes it very difficult for any kind of decision-making process to be viable, keeping in mind very often one veto can just prevent a decision to be made by the European Council. We saw it recently, and I would say, fortunately, the context that concerns us today, by countries like Hungary and Slovakia. Now we can even anticipate the Czech Republic, in the wake of the election of its president, to probably join the fray. And so you have a lot of disparities, a lack of consensus on many issues. And it's interesting to see that, like during the COVID sequence, a lot of countries decided to unilaterally re-establish, for instance, their borders. So Brussels looks like a paper tiger. And at the same time, I think the globalist elite, who have always considered the European project as a stepping stone to their project, their dream of a one world government, decided to basically double down and try to, through their agents like von der Leyen, Callas, and the likes. Probably Macron was almost literally out of France and on his way to, so he hopes at least, become the first president of the united super federal state in Europe. They decided to double down and to acquire new competence, new domain of competence, which the text, European legislation and founding text and treaties do not envision that they would exert influence on. And this includes, as we've seen very recently, issues of defense, which whether it's about the financing of the new colonial project in Ukraine, or the desire to somehow entertain perpetuating the war in and of itself, even though the reality on the ground would hint otherwise, shows that the EU has become this kind of out of control project, which a lot of people had warned back in 1992. People like Philippe Seguin in France at the time, around the time the Maastricht Treaty was being voted upon in a referendum. Since then, we have had the 2005 referendum on the Constitution, which was rejected quite handily in France by close to 55% of the voting population. It was also rejected in the Netherlands. It was rejected in Ireland. And we saw that the EU project was, if anything, not democratic whatsoever, because they basically rejected what the population of those three states had advocated, and decided in various ways to basically circumvent the popular will. That's when we understood that the EU project was but a prison. We can see that the well-being, the economic prosperity of the population is the least of their worries. This is a project predicated on lobbying and outsourcing and opening up all the European markets far and wide to economic entities outside of Europe, which do not care about environmental norms. Not that I'm a green enthusiast myself, but if we look at what was sold to us as a paradigm to do business, basically the European Commission does not seem to show a lot of care as to the partners that it deals with. So it's all about neoliberal policies. It's all about opening up wide open the doors to predatory practices by non-European constructs, and in so doing, basically destroying the very tissue of European industry, European agriculture, European savoir-faire, European arms industry as well, especially when you look at what Poland, to name but one of those countries, does with what it gets back from Brussels. It is not a net contributor to Brussels. It gets a lot of money back from the center. And the first thing it does when it decides to ramp up on military hardware is to buy American F-35. So there's not even any concerted protectionist European-made approach to promoting European interest in the strictest sense. In that regard, it is not a wonder that the ultimate level of the rocket, the last étage of the lunar module, as it were, would see a country like Germany, which for a long time has been the economic engine of Europe, but has no political independence whatsoever from the US. And in so doing, ever since 1945, it's not surprising to see that the economic lifeline of that country, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, would basically be subjected to state terrorism without the German official authorities basically reacting in a way that reflects any kind of political sovereignty. So that gives the question, if those countries are not sovereign, if they do not care about their own population, if they don't even follow their own principle as far as promoting a European homestead at every level, such as the ones that I just mentioned, then what is the use for Europe? If you add to this all this ideology bearing on post-structural philosophies, quote unquote, the gender theory, the agenda of Davos, the digital control, facial recognition, mandatory vaccination, and the likes, Europe has turned into a nightmare, and it is high time that the European people do whatever it is possible in their power to break away and recover their sovereignty. That's really what is at stake in this conversation I think we're going to have today. Ukraine has just been a revelator of this carefully crafted trap that the globalist elites have set up for Europe.
Which is very imperative, and with your actually contextual analysis of our topic, we could actually arrive at the conclusion saying that it's a plethora of events which have been marked in the agenda or the political trajectory of Europe, and we are going to answer subsequently if all of these have kept the bloc at this juncture where it is at the particular moment wanting. And in the same perspective, we get your own viewpoint, Conrad Request, especially on the historical framework of the diplomatic status of the European Union and how it is maybe counteracting its own personal agenda, like highlighted by Arnold Davely, that meets the objective of citizens.
Yeah, well, I would say that, of course, I totally agree with my friend Arnaud about these negative evolutions, in fact, the degeneration of the European structures. We can see that this is a deeper and deeper division between the interests of the financial and political elites of European Union acting towards creation of the European superstate, and of the interest of the ordinary people living, especially in the states of the European Union, but also the ones related strongly to the European Union, for example, the United Kingdom. When we read the past, we can see that the background for the creating a new way of European cooperation was to avoid conflict, especially military conflict. So it was strongly linked to the experience of the World War and to the all this destruction of the continents. It was also, and it is hardly remember now, it was also reaction, especially of the this time French government, reaction to American domination of Europe, and especially in the times of the President de Gaulle. It was visible in his personal relations with German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, and well, in his de Gaulle resistance against joining the European structures by the United Kingdom, which was then seen as the closest ally, strategic allies, and even agent of influence of the United States in Europe. So, but another element, apart from these geopolitical ones, was strongly related to the common values, to this strong historical base and tradition of deep humanitarian, Christian also values, which created Europe for 100 years, despite, of course, of the negative aspects of the Western civilization. We all know them as a colonial approach, as slavery, as development of neoliberal capitalism. Apart from that, this element of humanism was still existing within European identity. Of course, we all know that the present European Union is something completely different, even opposite to this European tradition. As Arnaud mentioned, it's some kind of the globalist experiment in miniature. So it was a kind of it was attempt to create not only some pre-world government, so some kind of experiment before creating the real world government, but it was also attempt to create some kind of completely new identity based on unrooted people coming all over the world, coming to Europe as immigrants, with, well, shifting down all the best interests and traditions which have been shared by the people living in Europe for centuries. And this experiment has failed, in fact. So this neo-European identity, which was created by the bureaucrats and financiers of Brussels, this part of the global financial markets which acted through Europe, was completely unattractive for the migrants coming to Europe. They preferred to keep or to return to their own traditional values, whatever coming from the West India, Africa, or wider Muslim countries. And it was, of course, extremely oppressing toward the people, to the natives of the European states. This neoliberal agenda, Arnaud already mentioned about including all these elements of moral progressivism, of transgender, of the creating some kind of the cult of the climate transformation, climate transition, energy transition as well. All these elements, it was completely strange to the people living here, but oppressed by new political form of the neoliberal government in Europe. We are facing decline of what we know, what we knew for decades as liberal democracy in the West, especially in Europe. We are facing something which could be called neoliberal authoritarian regime in Europe, with their own doctrine, with own attempts to create new identity, and of course with elements of own geopolitics. So when we know exactly, for example, that it was European politics who have been present in the very beginning, in the very early stage of the Ukrainian crisis, so we cannot be surprised that this European attitude toward an attempt of ending this war is completely different than, for example, could be presented by not only Russians, of course, but also by Chinese, by Indian, by non-European powers, including significant part of the American political elite under the presidency of Donald Trump. Europe is kind of neoliberal globalist experiment which has failed, but which is still fighting, especially for profit and for money and financial influence over what has left from Europe.
And of course, we want to ask if actually should there be a balance of power to fix the situation and give again a positive outlook, or what will give a positive outlook to Europe's diplomacy at this juncture in line with its position pertaining the Ukraine crisis. We want to welcome Yulia Berg, political scientist and also founder Global Experts Club. You're welcome to the program this day, dear Yulia, and welcoming you straight away with an opening question. We saw the proposed peace agreement, the 28-point peace agreement or plan by Donald Trump. And after closed door meetings between the Russian and U.S. official, actually put the European Union in a hotspot, and we saw utterances regarding Russian frozen assets and other moves that can be taken according to them. The Secretary General of NATO was talking, should be last week, highlighting that they are going to continue exerting much economic pressure on Russia in order to ensure that it neutralizes its position for them to attain the objective in Ukraine.
Yes, we see how this conflict has actually changed the geopolitical landscape, and Arno was just talking about the previous period of time characterized by different types and forms of interaction, while we could see that there was always kind of a frozen conflict that was frozen after the World War II, and pretty much it was frozen from the one side, the one representing NATO that was still trying to expand and still was actively trying to get new members and to promote the goals of weakening Russia and making sure that it's encircled by the military bases and that it always has pressure being applied to it. So the current happenings at the global arena are changing the let's say, the strategic approaches. And just recently with the publication of the new American military doctrine, we see a shift in priorities, and we see a shift in priorities towards more of practical goals, as the direct or let's say the proxy confrontation with all of the intelligence and all of the let's say technologies being put in place on the Ukrainian side against the Russian military were not proving to be as effective as they probably were believed to be. So the confrontation on the ground has shown that that it's not as easy as it could have seemed to achieve success against Russia. And I think it's one of the core facts that have been affecting this decision-making process, and also, of course, the economic benefits and the profits that are being lost at the same time with the sanctions and with the need to constantly change logistical means and all of those factors. This is also definitely affecting the decision-making process. But Europe, in this paradigm, is now seeing itself being alone at the warmonger side. Let's put it that way. And it's only Ukraine that is actively supporting that approach, because not to mention the shift or the change in the U.S. policy, we also see the key countries, or let's say the biggest countries of the global south, also supporting the moves towards peace and supporting the moves towards a new world order that would be built on cooperation principles and on the principles of multipolarity, that in this context would definitely imply more of respect for actual interests of the countries and more of attempts to actually consider those, because the let's say the hegemony or the system, when it was possible to push through any kind of misleading information and any kind of misleading approaches, is seems to be almost over.
And taking also to the another problematic as to the role of the United States of America presently, and how it has affected Europe's or EU's diplomatic standing, given the approach taken by incumbent President Donald Trump of the United States of America. And this I'll be channeling to you, Steve Gill, political commentator. He just joined us now to note that he's also an ex-advisor to Bush and Clinton administrations. Welcome to the program, Steve. And here we want to look at the paradigm shift, which you just highlighted, in probably in line with.
Hey, let me grab this real quick. I got to do this Africa hit. I'll call you in a second. Let me.
Hi, Steve.
Hey there.
You're welcome. Please, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You're welcome to the program. Of course, I was directing this question to you regarding the paradigm shift in the state of affairs regarding the Ukraine crisis, especially under the Trump administration. Can we say that this is primarily the reason that the EU is wanting at this juncture, given Trump's stance, which is different from that of then President Joe Biden on its position in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think President Trump has just issued the annual, or once every administration, national security direction for the U.S., and there were several interesting pieces of it. All of it reflects exactly what President Trump has been saying. He wants to recognize China as the real adversary for the U.S. militarily, politically, economically. He wants to make sure that the U.S. establishes itself as the preeminent power in North and South America. But when it comes to Ukraine, it is clear that President Trump is frustrated with the amount of money that has gone to Ukraine that we're now learning the corruption of Ukraine has been expedited and expanded dramatically in the last 4 years, when hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars have flowed from American taxpayers and from European taxpayers into the pockets of many of Zelensky's cronies, if not into his pockets as well. And I think President Trump, in this new national security assessment, has made it clear that it is up to Europe to look out for Europe. He has raised the amount of money that Europe is contributing to its own defense through increasing their percentages and actual payments for NATO defense, but also that if they're concerned about defending Ukraine, they need to be the ones stepping up, not the U.S. I think that this is going to continue. This conflict with Ukraine and Russia is going to continue because both Europe and the Ukrainian administration are absolutely adamant in refusing any accountability, in any audit of where the money has gone. Clarisse, I've young sons. They're not as young as they used to be, but when they were teenagers, I would give them money on Fridays. And when they would come in on Saturday morning asking for more money, my first question was, what did you do with the money I already gave you? We should be asking and getting answers to that with respect to Ukraine. And I think the reason that the European Union and NATO and Ukraine don't want to answer that question is they know how many hundreds of billions have been diverted from what was intended for military use in Ukraine, for humanitarian use in Ukraine, but has been diverted elsewhere. So I think President Trump is at his ends game in terms of continuing to support Ukraine, particularly when there is a complete lack of recognition of reality by Ukraine. Russia did not just invade Ukraine on a whim. There were the Minsk Accords that Ukraine and the EU and NATO ignored and broke. There were agreements that NATO would not be expanded further towards Russia that have been broken. And the continued demand that Ukraine and the EU have that NATO be a part of Ukraine is a bright red line that keeps any peace deal from being done. And I think President Trump recognizes that. The idea that Ukraine will somehow win this conflict is irrational. You had Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, a few months ago declare that Ukraine is winning the conflict, but the front lines are just moving in the wrong direction. It may be the most insidiously stupid comment by a supposed world leader in the history of stupid comments by world leaders. Ukraine is not winning on the battlefield. Absolutely. Ukraine has no chance of winning on the battlefield, regardless of how many more resources and weapons that are provided to Ukraine. This war is lost, and it's time to end it in the carnage and move forward in a way of peace and prosperity that should have been done a long time ago.
Absolutely, it's about peace and prosperity. But then we find ourselves again at a jungle patterning the recent development around the Black Sea, and how this will undermine efforts or Ukraine's position in Europe, patterning. The economic dealings and otherwise. Coming back to you, Arnold W. From all that has been said, we want to come back again. In our preamble, we highlighted Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who actually noted or underlined or reiterated that Europe already actually stepped aside from the negotiations that could lead to peace in the Ukraine crisis. Here I'm talking about the events of 2014 and also the meeting between Boris Johnson and Zelensky that made him to probably change stance, patterning a peace deal that could end the flare, and a statement by Angela Merkel, which actually showed to the world that the main agreement for them was a disguise to give Ukraine time to prepare for more confrontations. And we bring us to this and in understanding how Europe's foreign policy, which is somehow largely divisive, has made it to lose its diplomatic hand in contemporary stakes of the Ukraine crisis?
Well, let's just for a second look at who was among the U.S. delegation that came to Moscow a couple of days ago. We have a former business associate of President Trump, Steve Witkoff, who last time I checked was not really occupying an official position in the administration.
Absolutely.
And he was accompanied this time around by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who, for whom it was the first time coming to Moscow. We can assume he has no understanding of the intricacies of the Ukrainian theater. Yet, this is all that Trump could muster to send. I mean, what was glaring was the absence of Marco Rubio, who's, after all, the Secretary of State. And so this highlights a situation which basically would tend to raise the question as to whether or not Trump himself has placed or has the required confidence in key members of his own administration. And I would say that in that sense, it shows that the Russians have been clear. I mean, their positions have been crystal clear for years now, literally, on this particular dossier. And what they want now is a team of professional negotiators to begin working in earnest. Those are very complicated issues, require a lot of technicity, a lot of verification mechanism. And so far, what we have is a couple of guys who have, are known essentially for, business ventures, which is interesting. Obviously, the Russians are never against the idea of sweetening any kind of deal with a prospect for joint ventures and partnership of all kinds, bearing on economic yielding. But for the time being, that's the problem. We don't seem to have anybody from the State Department, trained contingent to participate in kind of negotiations. Because let's keep in mind, those 28 points are not, this is not a plan. This is a series, a template of different thematics around which, consensually speaking, back in Alaska, both President Trump and President Putin agreed to initiate discussions on. So now we got to get our hands under the hood and we got to get our hands dirty and start working on the nitty-gritty of things. And this is where we seem to be somewhat facing difficulties because the State Department, as we all know, is neo-consensual. I mean, those people, they've been here for decades. They've cleaned out all the paleo-conservatives, all the realists. We see a few of them occasionally intervene on shows like Judge Napolitano's, like the former ambassador to KSA, Sherman, I think his name is. But, those are voices that are few in between. We don't really get to, see a lot of professionals, no-nonsensical voices. Instead, we get, the neocon, and the neocons are alive and well. They've completed against their transition. They always move from one administration to the next. They reinvent themselves, and they're here to stay. So until and unless, the America First crowd manages to invest all those institutional levels of powers and cleanse all those globalist/neocon crowd, it's going to be difficult, keeping in mind that we have a midterm deadline coming up in exactly less than a year now. Polls are not looking too good. If Donald Trump was to lose control of either one of the houses of Congress or both of them, assuming that everything goes copacetic in the negotiation with the Russians over some kind of agreement, if we lose the control of Congress, it might be difficult to get this particular document to be ratified. And so then we're back to square one. So this is going to be, a close call, to be sure. I think now the ball is on the side of the Trump administration. I think they understand the urgency of the situation. I think one of the most important priorities is to get rid of this illegitimate regime in Kiev. for simple reason that they are not legally entitled to sign any kind of document, let alone negotiate. Since, on top of it, they've shown their unwillingness to concede even the most basic ground on what is objectively observable by all who observe the conflict for the last 3 years. And then and only then can we envision maybe holding elections. And although this might not be in and of itself the silver bullet, but one thing for sure, and that's probably what we're saying now, through the peeling of the onion strategy. First, you get rid of Mindich, you get rid of the wallet, then you get rid of Yermak, the gray eminence. And you got about 70 people from the Servant of the People party who are in the crosshair of Nabu and Sapporo. But it needs to go faster, and we need to create such a vacuum around Zelensky that is politically radioactive, which he already is, but it needs to get into the people's head in Kiev. And to the extent, some people might be said to threaten his physical integrity, I was going to say it's par for the course. I mean, you play along, you become a pawn of, the globalist. You were entrusted with a project, you failed to deliver, it's on you. So, like McGregor used to say recently, maybe they'll, ship him out to Tel Aviv. I don't know what they'll do, but one thing's for sure, we need to, politics is personnel, and we have the wrong personnel in Kiev right now. So, if anything, in terms of optics, this has to change, and it should have changed, in my opinion, in the first 3 months of the Trump administration, the current one.
Okay,
Clarisse, can I respond to a couple of things Arnaud said, because he is right on point on so many things.
Okay. Sure.
Well, first of all, Arnaud, the problem with putting more State Department people involved in this is they're the same ones that, like Boris Johnson, Angela Merkel, Victoria Nuland, the ones who've admitted they promoted the war for their own advantages. And our State Department sadly has no knowledge, kind of as you point out with Witkoff and the son-in-law. They don't know Russia. We've had ambassadors that, like McFaul, that it was a disaster, that does not know or understand Russia. I've used the example of our State Department when it comes to much of our foreign policy. They all go to the same universities. They all learn from the same people. They are all academics who know nothing of the reality of the world. They're like an academic professor who's written numbers of PhD papers about the Kama Sutra, who's studied the Kama Sutra, but has never actually had sex. And those are the people that so often in our State Department are directing our foreign policy. So I tend to think that Witkoff and Kushner are pretty good representatives, not because they understand Russia, but because they know Trump. And Trump and his negotiations with Putin go pretty well, because with Trump, you missing everything is personnel. It's all personal with Trump. And if you have a relationship with Trump, and Witkoff and Kushner do, they're in a better position to more accurately communicate the reality of the business, of the world, of the battlefield, than I think what he gets from his advisors that, as you point out, are the neocons. And Clarisse, you pointed out, I think, the other great point of this, in my view, won't get resolved until you resolve Odessa. Odessa is Russian. Odessa should be Russian. And until the Odessa issue is resolved, and I don't think it's going to be resolved directly militarily, I think that Kiev and Ukraine will have to find a way to either have an abject surrender and then surrender Odessa. I don't think you go in militarily and take it. But until Odessa is resolved, you really don't have, I think, a resolution of this. So we may be back in this same position a year from now at Christmas talking about the same issues. And finally, I think Arnaud made a great point of that the neocons have been pushing this, those in our Senate, those in our Congress, who get funded by the military-industrial complex, both in Europe and in the U.S., they are advocating this. We need a new war, which is, in my concern that, okay, what are we picking a war now with Venezuela because that we need to send more missiles, bombs, and airplanes somewhere as the Ukraine conflict seems to ratchet down. And I think that's, again, why I like a Witkoff and a Kushner at the table. Now, I agree with also, Arnaud, that the 28-point plan was really a framework, was really kind of a high-level here's the general agreements. I was very pleased that the meeting between Putin and Witkoff was taking 5 or 6 hours. That tells me they are getting into the nitty-gritty, the dirty details that Arnaud was talking about. So I'm a little surprised that the result afterwards was kind of this declaration that we're not close to a deal, we didn't make any movement. Man, that's a lot of talk. And having been involved in negotiations like Arnaud and others, man, you aren't meeting for 5 or 6 hours on a framework without getting into some of the paragraphs and the sentences and kind of what you do. So I think they may have made more progress than we're being told, and hopefully they did. And I think again, the path to peace is for the Europeans basically to be shelved, which is what Donald Trump is saying. Look, you guys are irrelevant. It doesn't matter what you say. All you want to do is continue the conflict, so you don't get a seat at the table. And then the other conflict, I mean, again, this thing's complicated. If it was easy, we'd already pushed the easy button and fixed it. Who do you negotiate with? As Arnaud pointed out, Zelensky doesn't have the authority. The constitution in Ukraine restricts their ability to agree to a transfer of land that's already been taken unless you have an election. You can't have an election until Zelensky allows one. Zelensky doesn't want an election because he will lose. So, what's the chicken and egg situation of how you get to peace when there are some legal frameworks that have to be overcome, some election frameworks that have to be overcome? And again, it may end up with Zelensky in Tel Aviv. And then who do you negotiate with to get the deal done?
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, we see the many elements coming on. Just to note back recently, we were talking about war being a geopolitical tool, or war and international relations. And we want to bring it again to look at how maybe the continuation of war will help to maybe redefine the agenda of actors present, like Arnold noted and other panelists already, pertaining the real situation on the ground and the personalities involved in all the negotiations. I'll come back to you swiftly, Yulia, because when we want to understand some of the facts or elements involved in this, especially the position of the US, according to a research, we found out that 60% of the rare earth minerals, according to a negotiation between Ukraine and USA, that has to go to the United States, is actually in the Donbass, which becomes very problematic. And we wanting to give a diplomatic analysis of such stakes in line with a proposed peace plan, and if we can talk of its materialization and sustainability.
Yes, it is true that that a very significant percent of Ukraine's GDP was provided by those regions in the east of the country, the Russian-speaking regions.
Yeah.
And if you go a bit back in history, you would also notice that those regions have become a part of Ukraine not too long ago. And that was also a decision aimed at empowering and increasing the potential profits of that part of the USSR at that point, right? So there was quite a lot of policies aimed at redistribution of resources and making sure that those different regions are receiving a more balanced economy. That's number one. And number two, at that point, and even now to a certain extent, those regions and their infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, production chains, let's say, and all of those processes were much interconnected and, let's say, interdependent. It was more or less the same logic with the Baltic states and Caucasus, and it took a while to kind of restructure it. And if you look at the trade balance, for instance, before the escalation of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, you would see how much of economic exchanges and how much of trade was actually happening there, and how those processes were broken, including some of the production processes and energy infrastructure and many other things that were damaged or ceased to exist as a result of the conflict. So Ukraine definitely cannot be called a beneficiary of this situation. Because the aid that it was receiving, I mean, even if you just simply look at numbers, even with the aid it has been receiving from the United States and from the European Union, that never became an investment. I mean, that money just dissolved. It didn't remain anywhere in, let's say, infrastructure or anything physical that could have been used by the current or the upcoming generations, unlike the investments made in infrastructure during that previous period of time. And even if you look at Donetsk itself, the city was founded not too long ago. It's less than 100 years, and it was designed to be an industrial center aimed at production of aimed at mining and production. So there was a clear infrastructure design, not just for Donetsk as the biggest city of the Donetsk People's Republic, or Donetsk Oblast as it used to be called back when it was still a part of Ukraine, and a lot of interdependent processes in those regions that were ensuring economic and social stability, providing work, providing profit, providing social welfare, and so on. So yes, on the one hand, it is true that those regions are, let's say, in those terms, worth a fight also because they're producing a lot, unlike the regions of the west of Ukraine, that mostly that the economy of which is mostly based on let's say tourism and other kinds of income that is not directly related to production or mining or such things. So it is painful to lose that on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's something that has been very largely mismanaged in that period of time when Ukraine itself was in charge after it gained independence. And the same can be actually applied to Crimea, because when Crimea was still a part of Ukraine, it was mismanaged and it was not receiving investment. It was not receiving much of attention from Kiev. And the conflict itself, when it started breaking out and when it was escalated in 2014. Some of the reasons for that were also related to the fact that under, let's say, Kiev, those regions were not receiving much of attention. They were still giving a lot to the national budget, and they were not receiving much. And then they were receiving this kind of treatment when they were always worse than the regions of West Ukraine, let's say. And this is one of the disbalances that is very obvious. And if you go to Crimea, you will notice that most of the infrastructure and like most of the buildings were either, and it's obvious when you look at it, they were either built in the Soviet times or else in the recent, let's say, 10 years when Crimea rejoined the Russian Federation. So you will see that there is a huge gap in those times when Ukraine was in charge, and of course it was leading to quite a lot of frustration and disappointment from the point of view of the people. The same thing is valid even for this complicated period of time when the countries are still at war. Donetsk and places like Mariupol and DPR and LPR, generally speaking, they're receiving investment, they're getting improvements in terms of road infrastructure, logistical infrastructure, governance, and many other things. And people see that, people notice that, and they compare it with what it could have been if they were still, let's say, on the other side. And obviously, each citizen in the first place is thinking about, their prospects and prospects of their children. So It's a very clear conclusion when you just get to numbers and facts and clear comparison.
I can personally, connect with the situation during a press tour, which saw us going to Crimea, to Donetsk, and other areas in the Donbass. We could actually visit. We visited some of these historical buildings, and we can actually relate to the situation in Donetsk. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue with you, Conrad. From all we've highlighted, it brings us again to wanting to understand the place of the EU or Europe in the Donbass, and also its diplomatic antagonism towards Russia regarding its position in the crisis. I think it is imperative for us to continue to understand as to having an alternative for understanding of the real stakes on the ground, strengthening this diplomatic antagonism.
Yeah, well, I believe that it's really important to first understand what this war is fighting for now. And of course, this position is completely different from different sides. We know exactly what is Volodymyr Zelensky fighting for. He is fighting for more golden toilet seats, and of course for his own and his family and co-workers' personal security. And that's secured already by all these properties and bank accounts he had all over the world. Yeah? So that's absolutely obvious. He wants this war to continue to secure more time to get more golden toilets. That's obvious. From the Russia side, that is absolutely clear and transparent from the very beginning, because this operation started with very clear statement of the Russian side what they're fighting for. They're fighting against the neo-Nazis attitude of the Kiev regime, and they fight for the rights of the Russian-speaking people in the east of the Ukrainian state, and of course they fight for their own Russian security, which was at risk because of closing NATO influence 100 miles closer to Moscow. That was very clearly and directly started by President Vladimir Putin. But the point is, what is the purpose of European and American involvement in this conflict now? And I believe that it's absolutely crucial to see that for now the main contradictory point between Europe and the USA is not about land, not about territories in Ukraine. It's about Russian assets. Russian assets which have been already frozen in the Western banks and funds in the especially also in Europe, in Brussels, for example. That's the very crucial and sensitive moment for European diplomacy and economy to deal with, because we know from these 28 points of President Trump that President Trump said, okay, USA needs at least some of the money they invested in this war back for the American taxpayers, and the way to do it is first to secure a significant American share of this frozen Russian asset, and of course to get some gains from after-war rebuild, reconstruction of Ukraine. And that's something which is of course element of contradiction, element of argue with so-called coalition of willing. So especially with the United Kingdom, Germany and France, because they want their own share. They say, okay, about 200 billion euros of these frozen Russian assets are already in Brussels, in Euroclear fund. So we are to deal with this money. We are to take our bigger share of this. If not, we will support Kiev enough to continue this war. Because we have to be aware that, of course, with the time, as Steve mentioned, when this war continues, of course, Ukraine continue to lose it. So Kiev regime lost control over more and more territories. That would be probably soon Kherson, Zaporozhye, Dnipro, and finally Odessa. That would be something which is absolutely we cannot see that different. That absolutely must happen, of course, with time. Of course, there will be a lot of Ukrainian victims, a lot of destruction. It is always related to war. But this amount of the Russian assets frozen in the West is constant. That will be all the time. That will be the same money to be divided by the superpowers. So, of course, Europe is Piper Tiger. Arnaud is absolutely right. That's a Piper Tiger. That's a fake superpower, and they know exactly that they cannot keep this war going indefinitely. This is impossible for Europe to send own troops in line to fight together with the Ukrainian ones. A couple of months ago, when we discussed about the very first attempts to create this corps of Europe, European Corps of Peace to be sent to Ukraine, we mentioned that in fact all these European military and political superpowers are able to create not more than about 20 to 30,000 people to be sent there. So it's absolutely ridiculous when you compare that to the size of the Russian army as well to the present Ukrainian one. But they still. So they are not economical power, they are not military power, and they are absolutely not in political power to keep this war going forever. But they still can support Zelensky long enough to get the bigger share of this Russian asset in the future. Of course, it's a question of this American chicken play. Who turn away first one. That's the point. And the real tragedy will be with no one. Turn back, and then we have the crash. And of course, the crash at the cost of Ukraine, the cost of the especially European, Eastern European nations who are to be next involved in this conflict. But still, this is now conflict and war only for assets and for money. And for many reasons, it was this platform, this element of analysis of this conflict, which was present on the very beginning. Of course, NATO wanted to shift its borders to be closer to Moscow. But in fact, it was the great invasion to the assets and to the possibility to exploit the Ukraine, but also to steal money of the Russian banks and of the Russian budget located in the Western Bank. So it's a war for assets now. From one point, it's a war for the golden toilets. It's for another point. So only ordinary people, also ordinary people of Ukraine, are totally forgotten from the Western side involved in this conflict, and that's sad, and that's tragedy for everyone.
Absolutely, and it brings us now to asking the question: if Europe has lost its diplomatic voice, it is imperative to answer in another dimension, because according to some pundit, we are supposed to to hold the West responsible for the crisis in Ukraine. And we want to use this to answer the question if Europe has lost its diplomatic voice. With you, Steve, looking at the role of the West in the outcome, or probably the outbreak of the Ukraine crisis, and its presently tactics in the region, how it is to rule the peace process. Because according to the same pundit, Russia cannot actually go into war because it values lives. And this is coming from a professor, a U.S. professor, which I unfortunately I cannot get the name, but probably in the course of the program we're going to get the name. Let's understand that crucial role that has made it very impossible to have a peace in the region, and also to bring in the EU in some sort of regress, patterning its diplomatic stand.
Well, first of all, I think the professor, maybe Professor Sachs, but I'm not entirely sure. But I think that the West is largely responsible of this moving forward into a conflict. As you mentioned earlier, that the West decided that the elected representatives in Ukraine were too close to Russia, and they removed the leadership with the maiden coup, with the efforts to replace elected leadership with more Western-friendly leadership, ultimately in Zelensky. So, as was pointed out, they've acknowledged that whether it was Boris Johnson, whether it was Victoria Nuland, whether it was Angela Merkel, that they were trying to ignore the Minsk agreement and Minsk Accords in order to give just some time for Ukraine and NATO to build up to be able to do exactly what they did. And people, I think many people forget that Kamala Harris went to Kiev and declared that Ukraine would be brought into NATO. 3 days later, Russia initiated the special military operation. Now, here in the U.S., we knew that Kamala Harris, as vice president, was irrelevant and nobody cared what she said. But I think for the Ukrainians and for Russia, it looked like it was a message that was being sent. And obviously we had the corruptocrats in the Biden family that were profiting from Ukraine before and have profited during as well. So I think clearly the West helped precipitate this. I do want to touch on these rare earth minerals because I agree with almost everything Conrad just said, with one exception. I don't think President Trump is wanting to get repayment of the hundreds of billions that have been invested in Ukraine from the frozen Russian assets. I think President Trump and his team, Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, understand that is opening a Pandora's box of seizing assets of foreign nations that are deposited in your nation, creates the tit for tat. Well, we'll do the same thing. Nobody wants that has, the IQ above room temperature. I think what President Trump recognizes is that the rebuild, in particular of eastern Ukraine, the business opportunities with Russia, whether it's developing opportunities in Antarctica, whether it's developing opportunities back in the Russian Federation, that's where the profiting can come from in a legitimate way that will ultimately compensate the U.S. And then these rare earth minerals, as was pointed out by Yulia and by you, Clarisse, there are these rare earth minerals that are in the eastern Ukraine portion, the Donbass, Luhansk, Mariupol areas. Those minerals are important. China has a lot of them. We have a lot of them here in the U.S. What's really important, though, is the processing of those materials. China has all these processing plants to convert the rare earth minerals into actual commodities and manufactured goods. The U.S. is about 2 years behind, maybe a year behind, in being able to develop the processing plants to take those rare earth minerals and turn them into something. I think the same thing is true in eastern Ukraine. And when you look at the opportunities to create wealth, to create prosperity in that area, not only the mining of those materials, but setting up processing plants in eastern Ukraine to take those materials and really make them extremely valuable by turning them into goods and products that can be used is absolutely vital. And I think that's where I would say is the best prospect of recovering the hundreds of billions. And finally, Clarisse, as you and Yulia know, we were in Mariupol, we were in LPR, DPR, and what we saw was, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, the Chinese building new apartments, building roads, building the infrastructure. I want my American companies over there doing that. I want us building apartment buildings. I want my clients building apartment buildings there. So that profit and that prosperity can happen once this conflict is over, once we get back to doing business with each other. And I think, again, President Trump recognizes that China is the real military, political, and economic adversary to the U.S. and the world. Well, let's not keep pushing Russia into their arms. Let's get some American contractors over there building some of those apartment buildings and rebuilding Mariupol and then eventually rebuilding Pokrovsk and these other areas that have been devastated by war. They're going to need apartments. They're going to need roads, and I want American companies over there doing that.
Of course, very imperative. In the same perspective with you, honorably, here we want to look at the place of the U.S. in the negotiations in Ukraine, and also look at the position of the European Union, and try to analyze in terms of the relevance of the EU in having probably diplomatic influence in today's, agenda of the peace in Ukraine. Do you think U.S. presence is already a threat to the European Union in terms of its security should the U.S. decides to, limit or withdraw security support to the European Union? How is this going to change the diplomatic or geopolitical standing of Europe in the Ukraine crisis and the way the consequences of this to the war?
Well, I think it's a trope to think that European security is endangered by anyone other than Europe itself, which in turn answers the question as to European good faith in approaching the Ukrainian equation from a diplomatic point of view. What they are trying to do is essentially perpetuate the conflict by every crooks and crannies and try to make, extend time. They want to try to bank on the internal American political calendar and hope that within a year, Donald Trump will be on the back heel facing probably some hysterical attempt to impeach him over this time around, probably the Epstein files. We can speculate on that, but the idea is to basically to buy. They're bidding for time right now. They're bidding for time because this is the only option they have. They know that politically they cannot afford to allow a peace deal or some kind of agreement, if anything, to transpire, to be then ratified by a GOP-controlled Congress, because then they would be forced to face their own constituents. And the political repercussions of this would be terrible for all of them. They're all very much aware of that. I think it was George Galloway who mentioned something in terms of opinion polls. If we were to aggregate the approval polls of Starmer, Merz, and Macron, we would be far short of the 50%. So those people are demonetized. Many of them, at least for Macron, I can speak for Macron, faces probably a lot of legal challenges within France, not least owing to the pack of corruption, as we call it there, which saw most of the French industrial fleuron being sold out for pittance. So essentially, even though Sarkozy removed the old definition of treason from the Constitution, we're still pretty much looking at something that constructively is akin to treason. So Macron is perfectly aware of all that. He knows that he's got a limited amount of time. They all have limited amount of times, including Starmer, who technically is not facing general elections until 2029, but about whom and Conrad made a very interesting and instructive podcast. I recommend our listeners, with former Ambassador Peter Ford and someone, I think, from the Scottish political scene, and they discussed how precarious Starmer's position is despite the official calendar. As for Merz, I mean, he hasn't been in office for a year. That AfD is already topping his party in the polls, and they have to resort to literally killing off AfD candidates in local elections to try to stem off, this bleeding out that the CDU is experiencing. So those three guys are sitting ducks. They're lame ducks, politically speaking, and on top of being diplomatically not inclined to play ball. And so, but that's the problem, is that we don't know what those guys are willing to try to escape direct political and also personal responsibility. This is, I think, something we should be very leery of. Conrad pointed out rightfully that if we look at the metrics in terms of manpower and in terms of weapon system. All three together, even on the aggregate, are no match for the Russian armed forces, which are arguably today the top military power in the world, bar none. But the fact is, we're still potentially exposed to provocations, as we saw recently with this MiG-31 affair. As we speak, I'm sure the FSB is extremely busy trying to kill any kind of destabilization ploy in the egg. And it's going to remain like this for as long as, at least on the battlefield, the outcome is not definitely resolved.
Yeah.
And although the Russian armed forces are moving faster and faster, liberating more and more settlements every single day, the question is, if we look at the pillar of one of the twin pillars of the SDO, which is denazification, that means you need to either do a decapitation strike in Kiev, which would be probably exploited by Russia, the Western media, or you need to go all the way to Kiev and basically engage in a denazification process, which we know, going back 80 years, whether it's about Germany or Japan, requires sometimes years to re-educate the population. So, and that would be probably a gift from heaven as far as the neocons are concerned, because then they could try to ignite some guerrilla warfare. Let's keep in mind that Western Ukraine is not friendly territories, and you need to have substantial personnel on the ground to keep the cities going and the public services. So this could really quickly turn against the Russian agenda, and that could become a politically hand grenade as far as Russian public opinion. So it's Russia needs the U.S. in that sense to clean up its own mess in Kiev. I don't care how they're going to do it, but they have to do it. And this is not something that Russia can do, but Russia can keep moving westward in such a way that instead of the 4 oblasts plus Crimea, we might be including into the mix oblasts like Sumy, like Kharkov, like Dnipropetrovsk, and ultimately Odessa. Although I'm a little bit less optimistic about Odessa, it's militarily speaking, it's not an easy situation, but it can be turned around as a sweetener in any kind of deal because it provides yet alone access to the Red Sea, and this is really, when one thinks about it, the only thing that would explain why the Europeans are also so in panic. They realize that if Russia takes control of the entire coastline, then what's left for them to really get involved into? So that could be something that is used as a card in future negotiation as well.
Bringing us again to another juncture for better clarification with you, Yulia, from all that Arnold has highlighted right now, pertaining the question, can we now talk of an existential threat within Europe and as far and also within among the stakeholders involved in the Ukraine crisis, and can this derail the trajectory for the U.S. Proposed peace plan?
The negotiations have been ongoing from the very beginning of the conflict, and we all remember the case of negotiations in Istanbul that almost reached a conclusion back in the spring of 2022, just 2 months into the conflict. Yet at the same time, we see that the positions of the parties are really hard to move, let's say, because for Zelensky, who has done quite a lot of not strategic moves, let's put it that way, it's a suicide to anyway. I mean, his situation is suicidal anyway because the war cannot be won at the battlefield because he's receiving more and more pressure from within and from the outside, and because whatever happens, it's a suicidal track for him as a politician, as a political figure, as a human being, maybe, right? So that's why he finds himself in a trap when he has to be very tricky about his own decisions and his own rhetorics, because we all also remember that he was the one to sign a decree that that said that any kind of negotiation with Russia was outlawed, and then he had to kind of cancel that. And then he had to be tricky about it, saying that it was supposed to be applied to anyone but himself. Which led to a couple of, quite comic situations several months ago when there were attempts to roll out this whole Twitter diplomacy and whatsoever else. So the process was always there. Sometimes it was tragic. Sometimes it was ridiculous. Yet at the same time, there were attempts to still hold the communication channels open and to still try to find ways to come up with a clear and balanced deal that would consider both actual interests and the situation on the ground. Yet at the same time, we see that the ones holding that position of fighting till the last Ukrainian are the European leaders that have cancelled the peace deal that could have been ratified back in April 2022, and that are pushing for escalation of the conflict now, increasing the risks of the conflict being, let's say, broader and wider. And they're trying to push countries like Finland, countries like Estonia into escalation and into, let's say, provocations, in order to still have a chance to restart their own political system and economy by righting a lot of the problems and a lot of the issues that have been piling up to the water that that is supposed to forgive all the mistakes in the policies that were being made and all the bad decisions that were made. Because we see that probably in the eyes of the European leaders, the only thing that can actually save Europe from falling apart economically, in terms of infrastructure and politically, is a game changer, and a major game changer, such as a war. And here, that's why we see that they're trying to stick to this kind of rhetorics as much as they can and push Ukraine into the very same thing. And going back to the question of negotiations, there, as I highlighted, there was always something happening within this track. But I think now we have moved towards a more realistic solution situation, because of course the change of policies that came about with Trump administration comparing to the Biden administration is really creating much more chances for a peace deal and for a solid, realistic peace deal to come into action shortly. And I think we're counting months rather than years, as we used to be, because the conflict that could have been over once again back in April 2022 is now taking longer than the Great Patriotic War itself. So the biggest war Russia faced recently, the Great Patriotic War, which was a part of the World War II, was lasting less time than this conflict we're facing with Ukraine right now.
Why it is taking longer, and we've had series of failed peace initiatives with you, Conrad. Let's try to understand, what do you think is that strategic reason why the numerous peace deals, maybe peace plans or negotiations pertaining the Ukraine crisis have failed in probably in the past and in recent times? Can we bring some sort of the proxy nature of the war as to why it is difficult, given that war is a political tool? can we say that the proxy nature of the world is the reason as to why we cannot, or maybe actors are still not able to compromise or collaborate towards a substantial and sustainable peace plan?
Well, I believe that Arnaud mentioned a very important element. This war is continuing not only because secure position of Volodymyr Zelensky and Ukrainian oligarchs who just earn on this war with huge amount of money, so-called Western help. It's also to secure political position of the Western elites itself. We observed that, of course, in US, and I believe that Steve could say more about it in case of how the Biden administration was keen on keeping this war going only because of the private profits they received, including Biden's family members, as we know. And we observe quite similar situation, and Arnaud mentioned about it, that for Macron, for Starmer, for Merz even, it's first something which gives them the opportunity to present themselves as a great international leaders. I can say from the British perspective, yeah, because unfortunately Scotland is still part of the United Kingdom, as you know, that we see that absolutely all the failures Sir Keir Starmer governments face in the British politics try to be balanced with his increasing activity on the international level. So the more protests are in Britain about migration politics, about increasing prices, about the living costs, the more Keir Starmer is observed creating another coalition of willings, visiting Macron and Merz, negotiating with Zelensky, and so on. He remembers perfectly, as from the times of Maggie Thatcher, that never ever acting prime minister during the war has been dismissed. So that's the point. That's why he would like to have this war going. And even have more involvement of the British side, and I think that is quite similar to Macron and to Merz. Another important element is that this transition, this change of the American approach to Europe related to the politics of President Trump, which is of course could be the chance for Europe to just have their own position. To regain part of the sovereignty, which, well, we have to admit was limited by the presence of the United States, also military presence, but also economical domination over the Europe. So this chance now is well transformed in the hands of the European elites as another argument to create European superstates. So it's not to regain sovereignty by the national states, European national states, but to create another state exclusively governed by the Brussels and international, cosmopolitan, in fact, elites. And of course, we know, and Julia mentioned that it was directly European involvement first to starting this conflict. In 2014, it was MI6 agent, Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, who said to democratically elected Ukrainian President Vladimir Yanukovych, sign the deal with the protesters or you will die. That was directly the words of the Polish Foreign Ministry. And that was Boris Johnson who sabotaged the negotiations in Istanbul and prevented any peace deal to be signed, 3 years ago. So it could be long ago all over. And it's of course now Sir Keir Starmer, Macron and Merz who are keeping this war going. Because of the private interest, because of the interest of these political elites of the European Union and United Kingdom, and because of the ideological plan they have to create this world government in miniature. So to create this European superpower to still keep this neoliberal globalist agenda as an actor on the international stage. They just use this conflict to increase their influence and to transform Europe, wider Europe, so not only European Union, but also including United Kingdom and other states toward this neoliberal authoritarianism. And that's the purpose, and that's the reason why this war is still ongoing.
Absolutely, yeah. The third phase of our conversation will focus on the internal division in the European Union pertaining its recent or latest decisions that would actually aim at supporting Ukraine in this cause. But before we go into that, let's listen to this except where the European Union Commission, I beg your pardon, President Ursula von der Leyen and others outlined the plan for the EU, and then we'll come thereafter to analyze the the practicality of this and how it will affect the course of the war. Please, can we have the excerpt?
We diversified our suppliers to trusted. Last night, we reached a provisional agreement on the Commission's proposal to fully phase out Russian fossil fuels. We're turning that page, and we're turning it for good. This is the dawn of a new era, the era of Europe's full energy independence from Russia. Many believe this would be impossible. Well, the figures speak for themselves, and let me give you some. Today, Russian gas imports, so LNG and pipeline, are down from 45% at the beginning of the war to 13%. Coal imports are down from 51% at the beginning of the war to now 0%. And crude oil imports are down from 26% to 2% today. I always knew that we could deliver with unity, with resolve, and by building on the extraordinary work of the past 3 years. With our Repower EU plan, we overcame the worst energy crisis in decades. We saved energy together while ensuring energy security all the way. We diversified our suppliers to trusted partner, signing new partnerships, and we invested in renewables and nuclear at unprecedented speed. As we slashed Russian imports of fossil fuels massively, we also cut the revenues that Russia uses to wage its war of aggression against Ukraine. We were paying to Russia 12 billion euros per month at the beginning of the war for fossil fuels. Now we're down to 1.5 billion per month, still too much. We aim to bring it down to 0. We will continue to support immediate needs and help build a more resilient Ukrainian energy system for the long term. To conclude, this is a good day for Europe and for our independence from Russian fossil fuels, because this is how we make Europe resilient.
And of course, it is imperative to understand this. I start off with you, Steve Gill. Let's look at the practicality of this plan by the EU, and then look at the direct consequences on Europeans. I think it was yesterday in Germany where we saw protests, and of course people saying they cannot continue to send their sons to the war zone, and then we want to imagine the economic repercussions of such a decision on the country and citizens as a whole.
Comedian become a leader in Zelensky. Now we're seeing a leader become a comedian with the statements we just heard about European energy independence being on the horizon. I thought Mark Rutte's statement as head of NATO that Ukraine was winning the war, it's just that the battlefield was running in the wrong direction, was the most ludicrous statement from a leader. I would have to put him in second place after what we just heard. Energy independence in Europe by reducing the amount of natural gas and fossil fuels coming from Russia. They're just being diverted through other directions. And I cannot wait for the German investigations and prosecutions into who actually destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline to start reaching into the upper echelons of EU and NATO individuals. By the way, Clarice, I have to say that you always assemble amazing panels of people who are very knowledgeable, know what they're talking about, but also have the strength and character and honesty to tell the truth about these issues. And you've done that once again, I think, with this panel, and I appreciate you making me a part of it. You know, both Conrad and the other panels, Judy and others, have mentioned the fragile status of these European leaders with their own internal domestic power. Not only have they overreached in terms of trying to expand NATO and EU and created this conflict with Russia needlessly, but whether it's Starmer, whether it's Merz, whether it's Macron, they are all on very thin ice in their own countries. And it is the leaders who are kind of stepping away from the complicity with the EU, whether it's Meloni in Italy, whether it's Orban in Hungary, whether it's Poland continuing to show itself more independent than just towing the political party line of the EU. The leaders that are driving this ongoing conflict are in dire straits politically in their own homes, and I think that President Trump is actually in a strong position. I would point out that I think the economy in the U.S. is poised to be really strong coming into the new year. I think we're going to see interest rates drop, which is going to make housing more affordable, rent more affordable. President Trump is pushing away the flood of illegals that have come into our country, which will again increase the buying power of American citizens who've been supporting the flood of illegals. The big, beautiful bill that cuts taxes and helps re-energize America as an independent producer of fossil fuels is going to kick in starting in January. So I think the U.S. economy is going to improve. So I know there's concerns that the midterm elections could lead to Republican loss of power in the House and the Senate. I think that we will actually gain seats in both because the economy will improve here and people will start feeling the benefits of that. The other point I would make on the politics of this is that it's exactly right that Zelensky is trying to retain power because I think, as Yulia pointed out, he's a dead man politically and perhaps in reality. When this ends, either the Ukrainians are going to take him down or he's going to flee to another country and eventually will pay the price for what he's done. So he's trying to maintain control. And then the military-industrial complex, I think I mentioned earlier, has an interest in this war continuing, and the political contributions they make to people on both sides of the political aisle in the U.S. continues to have the Congress push this conflict. People like Senator Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, who was there for the Maiden Revolution, watching it and cheering it along as promises made by the U.S. were broken. You know, our military-industrial complex is producing missiles at $2 million a pop to strike targets that are being provided to Ukraine and others, while Russia is using $500 drones. There is no excuse for us to use $2 million missiles to take out a target when a $500 drone would do the same job, other than wanting to keep those industrial businesses in the U.S. and the political contributions flowing into members of Congress and the Senate in positions of power. So again, there's an old adage in American politics, and I think it applies all over the world: follow the money. And again, we get back to why isn't there an audit? Why isn't there accountability of where the money that has gone to Ukraine has actually ended up? Why are we continuing to use weapons that are expensive and not as effective? And on a final point, I would just say that in the Iraq War, a couple of decades ago, that was really a proxy fight between the U.S. military equipment and Russia's military equipment. Iraq was supposedly the fourth or fifth most powerful military in the world, and it did not take long to destroy them because of the advances of U.S. military technology versus what Iraq was using that was provided by Russia. Since that time, Russia has dramatically improved its military technology. This has been a proxy war between NATO and their military weapons and Russia's. And again, NATO's military proxy war has been lost on the battlefield, not just because of a lack of manpower, but a lack of technology and military prowess. So if they wanted a proxy war, they got one. And if they're smart, they'll learn the lessons from this one that while they denounce Russia as pulling chips out of washing machines to operate their military equipment, they can only lie for so long. And the final point I'll make is, Clarisse, Julia, you guys know I do a lot of media in Western Europe, in London in particular, and the hysterics of those who are the TV host in London over the fear that Russia is going to be rolling tanks into Paris and Berlin and London sometime soon if we don't stop Putin in Pokrovsk, if we don't stop him in Kherson, he will be rolling into Europe. And on the other hand, they argue that Russia is not even powerful enough to take Kiev. Which is it? Are they the most powerful military in the world, about ready to roll into Western Europe, or are they ineffective, as we hear as well? And I think, as was pointed out earlier, the idea of taking Kiev would just open up guerrilla warfare. It is not something that Putin or Russia has ever wanted, and they're only pushing ahead, taking more oblast to get a resolution that ends this. And they have restrained themselves from killing the thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who are surrounded, because their idea is to get to peace, not to engage in the endless carnage. But as long as there is this push for war by Western Europe, by the military industrialists in the U.S., it is hard to see a path to peace coming very quickly.
Arnold W., what can we say about the practicality of the statement of the European Commission chair? And do you think this will actually yield regarding the internal division? We know the position of Belgium, we know the position of Hungary, and other countries that feel that boycotting Russian energy will be very disastrous or detrimental to the economy of their respective nations.
Well, right off the bat, let's just say that the European Commission and the interest that it represents do not care about the cost of living for Europeans, the man on the street, per se. This being said, there's indeed a lot of internal divisions. We're seeing it right now over the issue of the Russian assets. We see the Belgian Prime Minister adamantly trying to say, I'm not going to be left on the hook with this. You want me to sign off, but they're going to be coming for me and for what Belgium is proportionally held to reimburse if I do that. And so now they're talking about trying to get Norway, which owns a gigantic sovereign funds, to somewhat fork out the equivalent of the sum that the Europeans are talking about stealing, because let's call things for what they are, it's about stealing. But even now we have someone like Christine Lagarde, who's not known to be, a realist or someone who's doing exercising, putting into place yesteryear's capitalism. Quite the opposite. She's a former associate partner from a major Chicago law firm. She's endorsed neoliberal policies, and she's now piloting the Euro digital project, although this has been postponed to 2029 because, again, Trump doesn't want to hear anything about it, and for the euro to become digital, it would have to first be the dollar to become digital. So, but this being said, she's no friend of ours. She's no friend of our circles, and she herself came out yesterday saying, there's no way, legally speaking, we can allow this confiscation of Russian assets to take place, because this would simply create a precedent. Let's remind that our viewers that even under World War II, Nazi Germany's assets were never touched. So this would mark a watershed moment, would render Europe completely useless as far as fiduciary reliability for other countries who might be tempted to store their assets there. So essentially, this is but one of the aspects. We know Hungary has also been steady in opposing all the most dramatic steps aiming to perpetuate the conflict, finance it, to the extent that we have an election in Hungary next spring, and you can be sure that the globalists are going to try to do everything to remove Orban, who's really their bête noire. But Trump's got Orban's back, so that it should be okay. But yes, there are a lot of people. Steve mentioned Meloni. Meloni, as far as the Pearl program is concerned, has also taken her distance from some of the most radical individuals within the European Union. So we can see that the entire attelage is pretty fragile on a lot of different issues. But again, it's we have a window which I think is quite short, quite narrow, and it will depend on the level of communication and coordination between Moscow and Washington. We need to start moving on the technicalities. Trump needs to appoint a team of experts, because the Russians are not going to entertain, Witkoff and Kushner's on tours of Moscow at Vita Materna. At some point, we got to get down to the nitty-gritty, and we have to do it in such a way that we have a deal sometimes early next year, no later than June, so that because then the campaign for the midterm will start in earnest. It will be difficult for on the political agenda, the U.S. political agenda, to use the last three, starting in September, all the way to the midterm. It will be impossible to do. So I would say, by late March, if we don't have some kind of workable agreement ready to be then promoted through the business circles in the U.S., would stand to benefit from those juicy contracts that can be signed with their Russian counterpart. And we need to look at it in that sense. In a very limited window, but it's a lot of work. It's a very complicated situation. It is not like a Gordian knot that you can just split in half. There's a lot of issues bearing on verifications, a lot of issues bearing on international recognition of the new constitutional order as far as territories are concerned for the Russian Federation. That's also something that Moscow could use Washington's help on to crystallize this in international text. So, yes, let's. I'm cautiously optimistic, but we've seen how times and times again how any kind of attempt to restrain the dogs of wars have unfortunately failed, and so we somewhat seem to have at the levels where it matters the most an alignment of celestial bodies. Let us hope now that we can extract the maximum out of this and transform the try, as we would say in rugby, before the time runs out, as far as getting this paperwork validated and sealed.
Absolutely. We are rounding off with you, Conrad, looking at the economic aspect of it. As a financial analyst, what is the practicality of the statement of von der Leyen, and of course, and do you think the European Central Bank can align with such? And when they say we are moving from maybe Russian energy, consuming Russian energy, we are talking about looking at also at the time frame that this agenda can materialize for them to continue their course. Will this not be somehow very detrimental to the economy of Europe as a whole?
Yeah, well, first of all, two remarks, if you're so kind. So, first of all, two more political issues, but strongly related to the economical situation. I totally, of course, agree with Steve that that it's not the end, but it could be beginning of the end. But still, the risk of increasing the temperature of the international relations is really high. And that's true when you read, for example, British newspapers. It's absolutely full of this warmongers, jingoist propaganda. When, for example, President Vladimir Putin said that, of course, Russia doesn't want any kind of war with Western Europe, but if it happens, so Russia is ready. Next day, the British newspapers published predictable targets of the Russian missiles attacking the British land. So that's the way of this propaganda works. So we every day brings us information about Russians under every bet, and that's absolutely daily treat according to the mainstream media in the West. That's the one very important element. Of course, we have to also remember that this dealing with the corruption scandal in Ukraine could be very easily shifted to the Western Europe. That's absolutely obvious. Of course, someone gives these bribes to the Ukrainians, and someone probably taken significant share of them under the table back to the West. So when we heard, for example, about investigation against Federica Mogherini, so the former foreign affairs chief of the European Union, we can easily imagine that not only Mogherini but also von der Leyen and other Western leaders could be exposed as being involved in this corruption system of circulating of so-called Western help between West and Europe, and that's also why they are so keen on keeping this war going. But returning to the only financial question, yeah, I've loved almost the same like Steve hearing von der Leyen speaking about this, significant strategical change of the European position, because I haven't read my research was mainly about energy economics. So I haven't heard and I haven't read anything about any kind of new resources finds. I don't know anything about new oil fields found in the Northern Sea or anywhere else. So I don't know where Ursula von der Leyen would like to take these energy resources from, if not from Russia. So it could be quite satirical if it wasn't so sad for the millions of the European families. And in fact, it's very popular point of view in Europe that, in theory, sanctions are against Russia, but the real victims live in Europe because of increasing energy costs especially. And I think this war was also provoked to cover this element of speculation of the energy costs, especially related to the so-called energy transition, all this great market of ETS, all this great speculative market of financial assets only, called as linked to the energy transition, but in fact being just speculative papers, banking papers, another false boom of the Western economy. And this war was very good to justify why prices of energy are hiking up, while of course all these doctrinaires promoting energy transition promised the people that wind is for free, sun is for free, so now energy would be just as cheap as thin air. So that was more or less the promises they given the people. But of course, the results are completely different. When Europe turned out of the Russian energy supply, when after this terrorist act against Nord Stream, after all this German energy transition, energy politics, Energiewende has pushed to be totally collapsed because of the lack of the cheap energy from Russia, Europe faced very deeply energy and financial crisis, and it could be easily compared to the one which started in 2008 till 2011. So that's exactly the same moment for European economy. But this time, Europe is not able even to run away forward with this activity policy. Now the only proposal from almost all European governments is another stage of austerity. So increasing taxes, Releasing any kind of energy prices gaps, and in fact, and of course reducing consumption. When we read documents just published in the very beginning of this conflict in 2022, that was the assumption of the European Commission that all the energy consumption in Europe could be as high as 25% for the families and about 15% for the industry. So that was exactly, that was not accidentally a result of this conflict. It was from the very beginning planned by these people. And this is element, of course, of, in fact, politically motivated agenda. Yeah. And I would like to point one more contradiction, because, of course, we could imagine this kind of anti-utopian new world where, for example, Europe is completely cut off from the Russian resources and, of course, not involved in any common interactions with Russia. But what would be very important factor on this transformation, this transition of Europe, that would be keeping as close as possible relations with China, which are the main world provider of the rare earth elements. Steve already mentioned about them. But in the same time, we know that this coalition of willing, that this European fake superpowers, including United Kingdom, France, and Germany, in the same time are in some kind of ideological war as well with China. So it's kind of, you know, of the nightmare for the Europeans. It's impossible for Europe to be in the same time in the economical and, in fact, proxy war with Russia, to cut all these economical and financial relations with China, and being offensive against the United States. It is unbelievable how it's possible for the European leaders to provide some suicidal politics. But still, we are seeing that. And, well, I really appreciate this realistic approach of Arnaud, because we know that even if it seems not to be very logical and very realistic for us, what we see from the European leaders, this politics is continuing by them. So, well, the only answer is that probably we don't know all the elements, the base, the strategy, but unfortunately we can assume that one of the possible scenarios for them could be the full-scale war as well. And despite all these efforts of President Trump, despite all these efforts of the United States present administration, and despite of the absolutely transparent and obvious interest of the European nations, these elites, these crazy elites, can push us toward another world war. And that is the great risk we can still find, unfortunately, quite possible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Quite a tight time for Europe, and of course, seeing its position in the Ukraine crisis, and also how it's battling with the pressure from the United States of America. According to some report, the U.S. has given NATO's European members self-defense outline or deadline, I beg your pardon, to 2027. So how will the bloc or the Europe as a whole handle the complex web of their agenda for Ukraine, and also you know, defining a clear defense pattern for the bloc or for Europe in the years to come? I want to thank you so much, lady and gentlemen, for the great insight that actually highlighted some historical elements that are very pertinent into the crisis, in the Ukraine crisis, very strategic points, and even the geopolitical entanglement that actually has brought Europe to its position of losing its diplomatic voice, not just in the Ukraine crisis, but also in major stakes of that pattern the world of international relations. Indeed, it's a moment of a paradigm shift and the world of total global transformation. So together we'll continue on this platform that brings together experts to exchange, to share in-depth analysis on issues of global ramifications, to continue to educate the world and bring possible solutions to the problems if they can mitigate the many problems which are interconnected in the global arena. It's the moment of transformation. I want to thank you so much, gentlemen, and wishing you all a wonderful weekend as you stay in the company of programs on your Pan-African television.
This program was brought to you by Globos.